Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the online extension of the 30th Colloquium on Pensions and Retirement Research, hosted by IPRA, the International Pension Research Association. My name is Hazel Bateman and I'm chair of IPRA. I'm based in Australia, and before we start meetings or events in Australia, we recognise the traditional owners of land. So before we begin proceedings, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. So as mentioned, the host of this online conference is IPRA, the International Pension Research Association. And this is an association of pension researchers which was established by pension researchers based at cepar, Netspar, the Pension Research Council, the OECD and IOPS. And our aim is to promote and contribute to pension research and ageing related issues globally. So this conference is in the spirit of that aim. We have an exciting program today. We have 13 papers with presenters from 8 countries around the world: the Netherlands, Italy, Switzerland, Israel, Thailand, Chile, Algeria, and the US. So we have a nice collection of global pension researchers. Our conference today is set up as a meeting rather than a webinar, and we'd really like to encourage audience participation. Each of the papers we have today, the presenters will have around 15 minutes to present, and then we'll have 5 minutes or so for questions and answers. We really encourage you to ask questions, but please wait until the end of the presentation. You can either use the hands up function or the chat function. Now, because this is a meeting and because you can all unmute yourselves, we would prefer that you kept muted while people are speaking. In advance, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation today, both the presenters and the audience, and also the session chairs for giving up their time. And I would now like to introduce our first session chair, Professor John Piggott. John is the Scientia Professor of Economics at the University of New South Wales and Director of cepar, one of the co-contributors to IPRA. So John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hazel, for that introduction. I think we should just get straight into this. Our first speaker is Jim Bean from Leiden University, and he will be speaking on heterogeneous welfare effects of using home equity for life cycle consumption. He has 15 minutes. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation. Well, this is research that I did with some colleagues from Netspar, quite familiar to probably all of you. And what we're interested in are the heterogeneous welfare effects of using different options to liquidate home equity for life cycle consumption. And to introduce this this topic to you, let me guide you through some of the key literature here. And of course, in the literature, we have known that the life cycle model is the key workhorse in analyzing consumption and savings decisions. And a very particular subcomponent of this literature is interested in analyzing to what extent people or households make optimal decisions. And the way to do that is that they both analyze what is optimal according to a life cycle model and compare this to what households or people are actually doing and see whether there are any discrepancies there, and then conclude to what extent people behave optimally. Well, one of such papers is the paper by Denardi and others, and their main conclusion, even in a pretty sophisticated life cycle model with bequest motives, out-of-pocket health spending, etc., they conclude that the wealth decumulates too slow according to the standard life cycle model. So this could means several things in terms of the optimal decisions that households make or do not make. Firstly, this could mean that people tend to oversave, that they have too much savings going on, or it can mean that they save in very particular savings devices, such as housing that is more illiquid than any other asset, and that they have probably potentially some psychological connection with this house, which leads them not to accumulate or use this house to finance consumption. Well, this is basically what the paper by Paterba and others argue, and that is that housing is a very important liquid asset for retirees during retirement. So there's a lot of potential to use this house to finance consumption throughout the life cycle. And one example of a paper that analyzes such effects is the paper by Nakajima and Telyukova from 2017. And they analyze the welfare gains from so-called reverse mortgages. And the key thing that they do there is to analyze retirees and see what happens when these retirees liquidate their home equity through reverse mortgages, and see what the welfare gains are, because it increases consumption possibilities. Well, we largely follow this Nakajima and Telyukova paper, but what we do is that we introduce different types of products. So we're not focusing on reverse mortgages per se, but we focus on different devices, different financial products, and that might be really interesting because our different devices also allow people to bring forward consumption not only within retirement, but also over the whole life cycle. So also to people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, where this consumption really tend to matter. So that's basically what we're doing in the paper. So what are the welfare effects of different options to liquidate housing wealth? And we're particularly interested in who benefits most from these different options. So we're really inclined to research these heterogeneous effects that households tend to have. So of course, why should this be relevant? Well, there are different stories going on there, but one of them is, of course, that this analysis might help in analyzing options to avoid oversaving. And I mean, many would argue that this is a pretty typical Dutch phenomenon. So we're studying Dutch households mostly, where in the Netherlands there's a lot of mandatory saving going on. But even in the case of a pension system that has fewer mandatory aspects, such as the US, we tend to see a lot of oversaving. So the Schultz and all paper from 2006, they clearly show that about 2/3 of Americans are oversaving. So this might help in thinking about some options to avoid such oversaving. Well, I think the main contribution of the paper is especially allowing for a lot of heterogeneity. So lots of these life cycle models tend to include a lot more, have included a lot more heterogeneity over time. So going from the standard model to heterogeneous agents, what we tend to do is that we really provide an analysis of population-wide heterogeneity. We have two types of sources where this heterogeneity at the household level comes from. The firstly, that is income and wealth. So we have very detailed income and wealth data from administrative records. And secondly, we have survey data on different preferences that people might have regarding smoothing and time preferences. So for the sake of time, I will definitely only focus on income and wealth and not so much on the smoothing and time preferences that we do analyze in the paper. So if you're interested, I can always refer to the paper. So to interpret the decisions that we made in our model, as well as understanding the results that I will present in a minute, I think I should guide you a bit through the very particular Dutch institutional setting. So in the Netherlands, we have households that particularly face a lot of mandatory components in their pension system. So we have the state pensions, which are mandatory, but we also have occupational pensions that are mandatory. Also, homeowners, they have mandatory mortgage repayments that the banks set them. And the government also allows Dutch households to have a very much tax-favored home ownership. So this leads to a housing market that almost consists of 60% of home-owned houses, so to speak. The rest of this 40%, only 10% is private renting. So 30% is about social renting. So this means that basically those who have the option to buy a home will definitely have the incentive to do so. There's not a lot of endogenous choice going on there. If you are a rational person and you'd rather buy a home instead of going through this private rental market, because this is also relatively expensive. So this is an important thing that we will see back in the model, where we don't make any endogenous decisions on home ownership, which is quite close to the actual situation in the Netherlands. And finally, of course, we have very little out-of-pocket health spending in old age, simply because there's a lot of coverage going on as to health insurances. So what we see as a consequence is that wealth is largely illiquid in the Netherlands. It's very much held in housing equity. We do see in some papers that the replacement rate is, at least the net replacement rate, is above 100%, meaning that people tend to oversave. We see no spending drops or wealth drops whatsoever in the Netherlands. And one conclusion from the Churila paper and others is that probably saving is more than optimal in the Netherlands. So that's the institutional setting that we're facing here. So regarding these data sources, so we take the heterogeneity from actual data, and we combine some administrative data with very detailed information on income and wealth, as well as on occupational pensions, and combine this or merge this with survey data from the list. So the list sample is representative for the Netherlands. I should have a lot of information on people's preferences, and we combine this with the admin information on financial data. The key blind spot here is that we don't have a lot of ideas on how big these voluntary pensions are for these very particular households. But on the other hand, in the Netherlands, we know that this is probably very small. So only about 10% of the income in retirement comes from these voluntary pensions. So 90% is all the other wealth and income that people would receive, and where we have an overview of what people have accumulated over time. To give you some impression of the heterogeneity that is going on and the potential of some heterogeneity in these welfare effects, I present some summary statistics, and here clearly we see that when we look at income and wealth components, we do see that the standard deviation is sometimes just as big or even bigger than the mean. So this means that there's a lot of potential for some heterogeneous effects for different households of liquidating their home equity. So for example, when we take a look at total household wealth, then the standard deviation is about twice as high as the mean. So there's a lot of heterogeneity going on, and it's this heterogeneity that we would like to study. So who's benefiting from particular financial products compared to others? So the model is very simple in the sense that we have a pretty standard life cycle model with a bequest motive. We've chosen to use a deterministic setting, basically because of two reasons. First of all, it's very tractable. On the other hand, it's very practical in the sense that we have to optimize this model for all the people or the households that we observe in the data. So when you have about 4,000 people in the data, you have to optimize this for 4,000 times. So which is a lot of computing time. So in that sense, it's practical to have a deterministic setting here, which means that we don't have any income risk, financial risk, or housing market risk at this point. And the only risk we really consider is the mortality risk. And there's no dynamics in marriage, separation, children, etc. And like I said before, we only focus on the sample homeowner simply because, first of all, this makes the computations easier. And secondly, this is quite close to the actual Dutch situation, where there's not a lot of endogenous choice in home ownership versus private renting. We consider basically four variants in liquidating the housing wealth. So our baseline is that homeowners keep their house and do not short sell, the so-called variant B0. This is quite close to the actual Dutch situation, where we don't see a lot of people selling their house when they're retired. And we compare this baseline to several options that might be relevant. And these options could be seen as two extremes. So first of all, we have the V1 option, where people have to sell their house at age 65, which means that at the statutory pension age, they sell their home, which means that they liquidate their housing wealth and they stop owning the home. On the other hand, in the situation of V2, we say that people keep their house and they use the option to borrow against the value of their home equity over the life cycle, which means that it's an option and people keep their home. So this could be seen as two extreme variants of policy scenarios, so to speak. When we take a look at these welfare effects, I think this is the key table that we present in the paper, where we show the welfare effects in percentages relative to the baseline. So we have the V1A, V1B, V2A, V2B. The difference between A and B is that in the case of A, 50% is used of the home equity. In the B scenarios, that's 100%. And one could argue that V2B would be the first best option. On the other hand, we would also say that V2B might not be feasible, so that V2A might be the most feasible option, simply because if you have some housing price risk, then the issuer of the loan would definitely would like to have some buffer. So you don't want to use the full 100% of the home equity. So we argue that V2A is probably the scenario that is most likely to be practically relevant. I should also mention that the V1 scenarios could have some negative welfare effects, so some welfare losses, because people have to sell the house at the statutory retirement age. On the other hand, the V2 scenarios are an option, so the welfare effect can be zero, but it can never be smaller than zero. Well, what we see here are some summary statistics of these welfare gains, and when we look at the most feasible scenario, V2A, you could see that the median welfare gain would be about 7%, but we would also see that there's quite some heterogeneity going on there. So if you start borrowing against your home equity for 50%, this could mean that over the whole life cycle, 50% of the people could benefit from that in terms of welfare effects between 3 and 13%, which is quite large. And of course, this is larger in the V2B scenario. So what is actually driving these welfare gains? And that is a combination of some mechanisms here. So clearly, increased consumption over the life cycle is a positive. On the other hand, missing out on the return on housing is a negative. This clearly isn't the case in the V2 scenarios, where you keep owning the home and you keep reap the benefits from house price increases. Another negative is that people might have a strong bequest motive. Well, if you consume more, there's fewer assets left to bequeath. So in that sense, that could be a negative effect, and the positive effects that we find is the net between here, the positive mechanism and the negative mechanism. So we clearly see that consumption is really important in explaining this increased welfare gain. To give you some impression here, we could see that this is average lifetime consumption, so over age. The red line is the baseline scenario. And when we compare the V1 scenarios, you see this continuous increase in consumption at the statutory retirement age, so people can consume more throughout their retirement period. The interesting thing about the V2 scenario is that consumption can be brought forward not only during the retirement phase, but throughout the whole life cycle. So here the dotted line, the difference between the dotted lines And the red line, that is basically the much of the welfare gain that we see. Well, of course, you can also take a deeper look at the heterogeneity. So here we have a histogram of the welfare effects, and here only about 1% of the people in the V2A, the most feasible scenario, have a welfare gain of 0. But you see that the bulk of the households have a welfare gain of about 3%. And of course, there we see a lot of heterogeneity going on here. Well, can we explain this heterogeneity? Well, we see that much of this heterogeneity is driven by differences in households with respect to their net housing wealth, which makes sense, the current income and their projected pension income. But the interesting thing is that we see very little heterogeneity effects of demographic characteristics and the so-called preference parameters. So much of this heterogeneity is really driven by their consumption and savings decisions over the life cycle. Well, concluding the paper, well, we find for the average or the median household that liquidating housing wealth leads to welfare gains, so respectively for about 11% or 7% in the most feasible option. We do see a lot of heterogeneity, so half of the population is likely to have a welfare gain between 3 and 13%. There's a lot of heterogeneity going on, but at least it's not explained by heterogeneity in preferences. And we do see that bequest motives are very important, not so much in altering the exact conclusion, but it does matter for the size of these effects. And at least what we hope to establish with the paper is that it could be a bit of a roadmap for future welfare analysis and especially for policy. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jim. Our third speaker is Markus Schmid, and he is talking about financial advice and retirement savings. Markus.
First of all, let me thank you for including my paper in the program. Paper is joint work with Daniel Höchle, Stefan Renzi, and Nick Schaub. And what you do here in this paper is we analyze whether financial advice provided by bank advisors to the bank clients can help those clients to better prepare for retirement. The paper has been around a bit, but we actually are now only in the very first very big revision, fundamental revision of the paper, which includes comments we collected over months, including, for instance, comments by Abigail from an earlier conference. So any comments, of course, are very welcome. Having said this, I have to leave, unfortunately, the session at 10:15 because my class starts at 10:15 as well. And then I'm going to be not that late. So what do we do in this paper here? What's the motivation for doing that study? In the last years, many countries around the globe have reformed their pension system, of course, to cope with demographic change in a way that eventually results in the transfer of responsibility from the state to those individuals. So they are more required to make their own provisions for their income at the old age. And here we have not our data, this is data from a survey conducted by Schroeder some years back. We have here data on the part that was provided by the state pension schemes, the companies, and also personal ones. And on the left-hand side, we can see that, for instance, in the US, about 40% is what the personal pension provisions are going to contribute to your income at old age. If you look at this, there's of course some variation. Europe is the lowest one. Maybe that's influenced, as you heard before by Jim, by the Netherlands, where people save a lot, as we heard. I also added Australia here, which is about 1/3. So this is in between the US and Asia. Now, what you also know from prior literature is that many individuals, and in particular those, for instance, that have limited financial literacy or are subject to behavioral biases, have time inconsistent preference, for instance, that they may have larger trouble to decide on their savings, and also, of course, for their retirement. And this can result in under-saving for retirement. Again, going back to data from this further survey, what you can see here is the fraction of retirees who indicate in this survey that they would have wished to have saved more for their income at old age. And here we can see that this is a majority across the different regions. In the US, it's about 2/3. In Europe, it's about 50%. In Asia, it's even higher. So what do we do in this study? We use data from a large Swiss retail bank. This is demographic data, portfolio data, wealth data, trading data, and also data on advice, on any interaction between the customers and the bank advisors, to investigate whether this financial advice that the bank provides can help them to better prepare for retirement. And we basically look at two different channels through which they can achieve that. One is by motivating or advising their clients to open and to contribute to tax-exempt retirement accounts. I'm going to say a few words on the institutional setting in Switzerland in a minute. And secondly, by entering and by investing in the equity market and earning the equity market premium. Now, our paper contributes to two different streams of the literature. One is the literature on retirement savings. As I mentioned before, there is some evidence. There's also some dispute on that, but there's overall some evidence on under-saving, and that this is probably mostly pertains to certain groups, for instance, females, poorer and less educated clients. We've also looked at those subgroups within our sample, even though I have to say that the poorer ones in our sample are still not what you probably would define as being poor in very general terms. What does our paper contribute to this literature? To the best of our knowledge, we are the first paper that uses actual archival retirement-related financial decisions, the portfolios and trading of clients, to analyze the impact of the advice on personal pension provisions. And by impact, we really mean that we try to tease out a causal effect of the advice on the decisions, the savings decisions of the households. And the second literature we contribute to is the literature on financial advice. Now, those doing research in household finance probably know that there's quite a large literature that shows negative impact of financial advice. For instance, that financial advice that you receive does not help you or does not have any stock picking or timing skills, does only reduce very few behavioral biases and so on. There are a few papers on a positive impact. The first of those two papers that I mentioned here, they show that US mutual fund investors can benefit from tax advice to avoid taxable fund distributions, for instance, which is a very specific setting. And then Johanil and Ayman co-authors, they have a paper where they use a regulatory change in Canada to show that financial advisors can facilitate stock market participation through mutual fund investments. But overall, there are very few papers that show any positive effects of financial advice. And of course, the question is, why do so many individuals, households rely on financial advice when they make up their investment decisions, even though the investment value of the advice apparently is not that large? If you compare this to other benchmarks, often you see at least not better performance, you see higher costs, so lower net performance and so on. Few words on the institutional background. The Swiss pension system is based on three pillars. The first one is the state pension system. Then we have the occupational pension system, and we have the private pension provisions. And the last is the one that we are looking at, of course. And the percentage numbers here are out of our sample. So this has two parts in principle. You can either contribute cash. You can have this on a cash savings account. This is about 80% in our sample, or you can invest in eligible mutual funds, and this is about 20% of the investments in those private pension provisions that we observe in our sample. Now, what is the benefit of doing that? On the one hand, you have tax benefits. There are no income taxes, so this is tax deductible what you contribute those accounts. There are limits on what you can contribute. If you're employed, this is about 7,000 Swiss francs per year. If you are self-employed, this is 20% of your income, and it's capped at about 38,000 Swiss francs. So you cannot provide or contribute in unlimited amounts and benefit from the tax savings. If you just consider the tax benefit for the median person in our sample, doing a back of the envelope calculation, we can see that about 2% of the annual income each year is lost if you do not contribute the maximum you could in those tax-exempt retirement accounts. They also offer higher interest rates on the cash part than normal savings accounts, and there are no fees on retirement accounts. So overall, they are less costly and they provide tax benefits. Of course, they're at the cost of some liquidity, so you cannot withdraw that money at any time you wish. There are certain reasons for why you could do that. For instance, if you buy self-occupied real estate, you can use or withdraw the money from those accounts if you leave Switzerland for good, or if you open your own business. There are no fees on those retirement accounts, as I said before. And what is, of course, also the other important part besides the retirement savings system is the financial advice. How does this work in Switzerland? This is typically provided by banks through bank advisors that you assign to those clients. And what became common in Switzerland is that you pay a fixed annual fee to receive investment-related financial advice, but that retirement-related advice, which is the type of advice we look at here, is free of charge and available to any bank client. And this is exactly also how this works at our bank. A few words on the data. We have data from one large Swiss retail bank, as I said before. Time period is 2011 to mid-2021. It's a random sample of the bank's private clients whose wealth exceeds 75,000 Swiss francs at least once during the entire sample period. This is approximately $79,000 US. Of course, for those that have very small checking accounts of 2,000 Swiss francs, they usually have no interaction with their advisors at all. We exclude foreign clients because, of course, the pension system, as we already heard also in this session, of course, differs across countries. And we also exclude clients who are already retired because this paper is about pension savings. This leaves about 20,000 clients in our sample. And for time reasons, let's skip the upper part of the descriptive stats. They are matching quite nicely to this kind of somewhat more wealthy part of the Swiss population. But Switzerland overall, of course, is a quite a wealthy country. So even those clients here, they're not that much more wealthy than the average Swiss person, holding about $165,000 US on average in financial wealth with the bank. And also the income and so on matches quite nicely. Now, what is important here, the age, of course, is much younger, but the reason is, of course, because you exclude all people that are already retired. Now, what is important probably is the contact data. So we have overall about 183,000 client advisor contacts in our sample. Of those contacts, we know who initiated the contact and how this took place, whether it's a phone call, it's an email, or it's actually the advisor visiting or the client visiting the bank, or the sometimes for the more wealthy clients, also the advisor visits the clients at home. So we know how this took place. We, of course, know when it happened, and we know what the advice was about. So whether it's investment advice, for instance, whether it's tax advice, whether it's advice on inheritances, or whether it's, for instance, what we are interested in, retirement-related advice. 17% of those contacts are retirement-related advice, and of those, 77% are advisor-initiated. And this is what we're interested in, so we only consider those. And the reason is, of course, that we want to rule out that it's actually at the client's initiative and the client decided to prepare for retirement and then just basically was seeking reassurance or the operational details on how to do that from the advisor. We really want to analyze the advice that was provided by the advisor's initiative. So this is what we then eventually use. Now, the first result here, or the first analysis that I'm going to show here, is the determinants of retirement-related contacts. So these are logit regressions where the dependent variable is a dummy that equals 1 in month, where we have at least one advisor-initiated retirement-related contact, so the contacts we're interested in. That's the dependent variable. Then it regresses on a number of bank client characteristics. And if we, for instance, focus on those that we have seen that in prior literature are associated with under savings, we can see that there's no difference in gender. So whether you're a man or a woman, you're equally likely to be approached by your advisor on retirement-related issues, but wealthy clients are more likely to be addressed. And of course, these are those that are at a lesser risk of undersaving. We can see that education also goes the opposite direction. So the more educated you are, the more likely you are going to be contacted. We remove this or put this in a second specification because data on the education of clients is only available, as you can see at the bottom, for roughly half of the clients. So these are about 1 million out of 2 million client months that we have. What is important here, we can see that advice is not provided randomly. So we control for those characteristics in our regressions. And we also do, as we'll see later on, a propensity score matching analysis where we match those client months in which there was a retirement-related advice to very similar client months that have a very similar propensity to receive this kind of advice, but there was no advice. Now, this is our first set of results. I show the graphs here. We, of course, also do this in regressions in the paper, but it's easier and quicker to show this here. So on the left-hand side, in the first chart, what we have here is the probability to open retirement accounts. And this, of course, is a sample that's restricted to clients that do not have such an account before. And what you can see here is in month 0, so this is the timeline here. In month 0, we can see that the unconditional probability in our sample that even includes the advised month is 0.3%, but then the probability to open such an account jumps by a factor of roughly 30 to 8.7%. It's still elevated a month later and then slowly fades out. So receiving this kind of advice is strongly related to the probability to open a retirement account, which allows you to save taxes, is more cost efficient and so on. Then in the second chart, we restrict the sample to clients that already have such an account, and we look at the intensive margin, we look at changes, the contributions to those accounts, and again, we can see that we have a huge spike here, factor of 4 to 5 times the unconditional average in the month of advice, and this is again elevated months later, but then fades out. Now, the problem is here, this kind of data we only have at a monthly level. The savings accounts, retirement account data, we have monthly. But of course, what we can do is we can look at retirement fund trades, because this we have daily. So any trading data we have with a precise timestamp. And what you can see here is that also those trades, if you want, net on net clearly purchases. This is the blue part of those histogram lines here. We can see that there's no pre-trend, and then we can see a jump on the day of the advice, even larger the day after, and then it again starts to fade out. When we look at the equity investments, we do the same kind of analysis. So on the left-hand side, we can see that at the extensive margin, the probability you start investing in equity. This is again not after receiving investment advice, but after receiving retirement-related advice, this increases significantly. The same at the intensive margin here, the magnitude of the effect is a bit smaller. It's a bit more than twice the unconditional average, but still we can clearly see that. If you look at equity trades, the same thing, no pre-pattern, but we can see that on the day of the advice and a few days later, we see a significantly higher amount of trades in equity, and on net, these are all also purchases. We do a number of additional tests. We, as I said before, we do this also in regressions, controlling for the client characteristics that we saw before, using different types of fixed effects, doing propensity score matching, as I explained before. We also do instrumental variables regressions, where we instrument this propensity to receive advice, and results hold in all of those different settings. We also do cross-sectional analysis. But here we do not find much variation across client characteristics. And in particular, we do not find the clients that are at the higher risk of undersaving are more likely to be contacted, as we saw before, and also conditional on being contacted are more likely to act on receiving advice. So this is not what you can observe. Finally, what is important, of course, or the second last slide, how do clients fund those retirement accounts and the equity investments? Where does the money come from? Do they, for instance, reshuffle within their savings? And this is not what we find. We can see that they use, on the one hand, external funds that are new inflows on their bank accounts, and they also fund this by using money from the checking account. Looking at the other savings, normal savings accounts, the equity investments they have and other investments, they do not decrease. So this is not where the money comes from. And the same applies to the equity investments on the right-hand side. Here, the fraction that is taken from the checking account is even larger, but it does not reduce the other savings of those clients. And the last result that I would like to show here is about the profit. How does this look like for the bank? And what we do here is we have as the dependent variable the bank's monthly profit with this client, which we can obtain from from managerial accounting data that are received from the bank. So the bank calculates all the revenues they have with each client and all the costs they incur by also allocating man hours, for instance, and so on, and having a number that gives them the cost, and this gives them then the profit per client. And what you do here is we regress this profit that the bank does on the host of control variables. Wealth, of course, this is all important to the type of accounts and deposits they hold, and then also whether they have a retirement account, which is what we're interested in, or whether they have equity investments. We can see that on average, those clients are more profitable to the bank. So this suggests that for the bank, at least, it's not unprofitable to advise clients to invest in those retirement accounts, equity, and mutual funds. Here, I combine this for time reasons. Of course, we also look at those two categories separately, but the tax savings and the cost side and so on is similar. So to conclude, financial advice has positive effects in terms of retirement savings. It induces clients to contribute to those, or open up actually in the first place, those tax efficient accounts, and to invest in the equity market and earn the equity market premium. On the downside, it is not, the advice does not really target those at the high risk of undersaving, and even conditional on receiving advice, they are not more likely to act. Actually, if anything, they are a bit less likely to act on the advice they receive. And the bank apparently also profits from that, even though there we have to do more analysis. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. Of course, I'm here for a few questions.
Thank you, Markus, for an interesting presentation.